The unlikely encounter. Officer James had been on patrol for hours, scanning the quiet streets, his eyes sharp and focused. The sky had been overcast all day, casting a dim, muted light over the town. It was one of those days when everything felt unusually still, with most of the kids in school and only a few cars passing by. It seemed like a typical, uneventful morning for the officer. But as James drove down the side street, something caught his eye. He saw two figures walking together on the sidewalk, an older teenager and a young girl who appeared no older than 9. The girl was skipping along beside him, holding his hand with a wide, carefree smile on her face. Her laughter echoed through the empty street, making her stand out in stark contrast to the quiet, sleepy surroundings. James squinted his eyes and slowed the patrol car, watching them from a distance. What struck him as odd was that the girl wasn't in school. It was a Wednesday morning, and children her age should have been in class. Why was she not in uniform, running around with a teenage boy in the middle of the day? Suspicion bubbled up in James's mind. As an officer, he had been trained to trust his instincts, and something about this situation didn't sit right with him. The teenager, who looked to be no older than 18, was leading her with a kind and protective hand. But to James, this only raised more questions. Where were their parents? Why was the girl not at school? His curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of unease, prompted him to make a snap decision. He turned the steering wheel sharply, parking his car right in front of the two. The tires screeched slightly, causing the young girl to glance up, her laughter immediately halting. James stepped out of the car, his heavy boots striking the pavement with authority. "Hey, where are you two coming from?" James called out in a firm voice, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. He stood tall, his uniform crisp, as if his very presence would demand respect. The boy, clearly startled but trying to stay calm, stopped and raised his hands in an effort to show no aggression. "We're just coming from the hospital," he said, his voice steady but slightly defensive. "This is my sister, Alana. We're just walking home." The girl, Alana, stood quietly by her brother's side, her wide, innocent eyes looking up at James. She seemed unsure of what was going on, but made no attempt to run or hide. James looked at the two skeptically, the words from the boy not matching what he had expected. A hospital. At this hour, his mind began to race. His gaze shifted between the two, searching for any sign that something was amiss. It wasn't uncommon for officers to come across situations like this. Children out of school, wandering the streets, without any clear reason. But James wasn't one to let things slide. If something seemed off, he was going to investigate. Hospital, huh? James muttered under his breath, not convinced. "And you, little girl, why aren't you in school?" Alana blinked, clearly not understanding why this man was questioning her. "I was with my brother," she said softly, squeezing her brother's hand tighter as she tried to understand the tension in the air. James scowled, his eyes still on the two of them. "I don't believe you," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "A girl like you should be at school, not wandering around. Where are your parents?" Luke, Alana's older brother, stepped forward, trying to calm the situation. "Sir, we just told you, she's my sister. We were at the hospital because she had a checkup. We're on our way home now. There's no need for this." But James wasn't having it. His suspicion had turned into frustration, and frustration into an overwhelming need to take control of the situation. He took a step forward, his hands resting on his belt as he looked down at the teenager. "I don't care what you say. This doesn't seem right. I'm going to need you both to come with me." Luke's heart raced as he glanced down at Alana, who was now looking up at the officer with a mixture of fear and confusion. His protective instincts kicked in, but he knew better than to argue with an officer. "We're really just trying to get home," Luke repeated, his voice wavering just slightly. "Please, we didn't do anything wrong." Alana's soft voice interrupted, her small voice barely audible. "I'm scared," she whispered to her brother, her face now pale. James took another step forward, this time moving closer to the young girl. "You should be," he said harshly, his words cold and commanding. "If you're out here, you could be in trouble. I'm taking you both in." In an instant, the officer reached for the handcuffs at his belt. Luke's heart skipped a beat as his sister's eyes grew wide. "No, please," he pleaded, his voice trembling now. But it was too late. James moved forward with swift determination, his hand wrapping around the girl's arm, and before Luke could react, he pulled Alana towards his squad car. Luke grabbed his sister's other arm, trying to stop him. "Stop. Let her go," he shouted, his voice full of panic. But James didn't respond. His focus was solely on the girl, and despite the tearful protests of the brother, the officer wasn't about to back down. Alana's small voice broke through the chaos as she called out to her brother. "Luke, please. I don't want to go with him." But there was no turning back. Officer James had made up his mind, and what he didn't know was that the consequences of this decision would soon change everything, for both him and the young girl who had done nothing wrong. As James pushed the girl into the back of the squad car, his mind still buzzed with frustration. He hadn't yet realized that this was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice and fairness. For Alana, this day would mark the start of a journey that would shake the very core of her beliefs. And for Officer James, it would soon become clear that his decision, one made in haste, was about to come face to face with the truth in a way he could never have imagined. The unexpected twist. The squad car's engine hummed steadily as Officer James drove through the empty streets, Alana's small form sitting silently in the back seat. The rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt was the only thing breaking the heavy silence that filled the car. Alana's wide eyes, filled with confusion and fear, stared straight ahead, not daring to look at the officer in the front. She had been dragged away from her brother without warning, without understanding why. The tears that had pooled in her eyes earlier were now held back, her small face taut with the weight of the situation. She wanted to ask him why he was doing this, but the words didn't come. She just couldn't bring herself to speak. Officer James, on the other hand, was resolute, though the growing sense of uncertainty gnawed at him. He had made the arrest, yes, but now, as the car rolled down the streets, the quiet, lingering voice of doubt began to rise in his chest. What if I'm wrong? James had been on the force for years, and his instincts had always served him well. But this felt different. The girl's brother had been polite, too polite. Alana had seemed scared, but what had she done to deserve this? His mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation. But the more he thought about it, the more his certainty wavered. He had always believed that he was doing the right thing, that the rules were clear and that the law always had to be enforced, no matter the cost. But now, as he glanced at the small figure in his rearview mirror, his mind began to drift toward the uncomfortable possibility that maybe he had made a mistake. Minutes passed before they arrived at the precinct, the familiar sight of the building looming in front of them. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars belonging to the officers on duty. As the patrol car came to a halt, James sighed deeply, unsure of the next step. Before he could even step out of the car, the precinct door swung open, and his partner, Officer Martinez, approached with his usual calm demeanor. But the moment he saw Alana sitting in the back seat, his eyes narrowed in surprise. "James, what's going on?" Martinez asked, his tone laced with concern. "Why's she in the back of your car?" "She was out of school, wandering the streets with some older guy," James explained, his voice still carrying a note of suspicion. "I wasn't convinced by their story. The girl should have been in school. I'm taking her in for questioning." Martinez studied the girl for a moment before giving James a puzzled look. "You're taking a 9-year-old girl in for questioning because she was out of school? What's going on, man?" James's jaw clenched. He didn't like being questioned by anyone, especially not his partner, but the unease in Martinez's voice made him second-guess his actions. He hadn't really thought this through, not fully. "I'll deal with it," James muttered, more to himself than to Martinez. He stepped out of the car and motioned for Alana to follow, but she hesitated, her eyes darting to the ground. Martinez watched the girl for a moment before turning his attention back to James. "James, come on. I know this is your call, but I've never seen you act like this before. Are you sure about this?" James gritted his teeth. "I'll sort it out. I'm just following procedure." As they entered the precinct, James led Alana down the hall, his steps heavy, almost too loud in the quiet building. The hallway stretched before them, empty except for the occasional officer passing by, but James's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, yet he pushed it aside. It was just a mistake, right? He told himself. Alana, meanwhile, had yet to speak. She wasn't crying anymore, but her lips trembled, and her small hands were clenched tightly in her lap. She missed her brother, Luke, who she knew was likely pacing outside in worry. She missed the comfort of home, of knowing she was safe. And yet here she was, trapped in a room that felt more like a cage than a place of justice. James motioned for her to sit at a desk, his eyes scanning the room as he took a seat opposite her. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. As much as he wanted to brush aside his doubts, they lingered. "Where's your school?" he asked, his tone more demanding than he intended. He was determined to get to the bottom of things, to make sure this wasn't some sort of ruse. Alana didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at the desk in front of her, her tiny fingers tracing the wood grain. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I go to Jefferson Elementary," she said, her words barely a whisper. James scribbled the name down on his pad, then glanced up at her. "And why were you with your brother? Why aren't you at school?" Alana hesitated for a moment. She could feel the tension rising in the air, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Her mind raced back to the hospital, the checkup she'd had just hours earlier. Her brother had been so kind to her, leading her home as he promised. But now, she was trapped in this sterile room with a man who seemed determined to make her guilty of something she didn't understand. "I was with Luke because I was sick," she finally replied, her voice quiet but clear. "I had to go to the doctor for a checkup." James leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. The story seemed too simple, too rehearsed. It didn't add up. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was well past noon. Why hadn't the boy been at school either? But just as he was about to press further, the door to the office opened, and Sergeant Daniels walked in. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room, a sharp contrast to the tension that had hung over James and Alana. "What's going on here?" Daniels asked, his gaze flicking from James to the young girl sitting at the desk. James quickly explained the situation, but before he could finish, Daniels raised a hand. "Wait a minute, James. Something doesn't seem right here. I don't like the way this looks. You're really questioning a 9-year-old girl like this." James felt his face flush with irritation. She should be at school. She was out on the streets, and I don't know what her brother's story is either. They weren't being truthful. Daniel shook his head slowly. "James, I know you've been on this job for a long time, but you need to be careful. Are you sure about this? Are you sure there isn't something more to the story?" James paused, the questions rattling around in his mind. The uncertainty that had been gnawing at him began to grow. He'd made an arrest on a hunch, but now, in the quiet of the office, that hunch felt wrong. He turned to Alana, who was still staring at the floor, her hands trembling in her lap. "Alana," he said softly, his voice softer than before. "I'm sorry for scaring you. I need to know the truth." Alana looked up at him then, her wide eyes meeting his for the first time. She had nothing to hide. She just wanted to go home. "I'm telling you the truth," she said, her voice steady, yet tinged with the fear of the unknown. "Please, just let me go home." James's heart clenched as he looked at her. The doubt he had tried to suppress finally broke through. Something was terribly wrong, but it wasn't with Alana. It was with the decision he had made. He hadn't listened. He hadn't asked the right questions. And now, there was no turning back. It was only a matter of time before everything changed. For Alana, for Officer James, and for everyone involved. But the truth would come to light, and when it did, James would wish he had never made that fateful decision. The shocking revelation. The moments dragged on as Officer James sat across from Alana, a mix of guilt and uncertainty churning in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake, but pride and his need for control kept him from fully acknowledging it. Sergeant Daniels had stepped out of the room to make a few calls, leaving James alone with the young girl. Alana remained eerily still, her small body curled up in the chair, her eyes never meeting his for more than a brief moment. The weight of silence pressed in on James. It wasn't like him to second-guess his actions, but today something felt different. He had dealt with situations like this before, but this one was beginning to feel like an injustice in the making. As Alana shifted uncomfortably in the chair, her gaze turned towards the door, and then back to the window. She was lost in her thoughts, perhaps wondering when she would be allowed to return to her brother, or if something terrible would happen. Officer James studied her, his mind still conflicted. She wasn't just a scared little girl. There was something about her, something that made him question every assumption he had made. She seemed so calm, so composed for someone who had just been yanked out of her brother's protective grasp and shoved into this sterile, impersonal room. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Sergeant Daniels returned, his face serious as he stepped inside. James felt a pang of unease at the look on his face. Something wasn't right. "We've got a problem," Daniels said flatly. "You might want to sit down for this." James stiffened, his body reacting instinctively. He had prepared himself for the worst, but this wasn't what he expected. "What's going on?" James asked, his voice tight. He couldn't mask the growing panic beneath the surface. His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them seemed to fit. Daniels walked over to the desk and leaned in, speaking in a low voice. "I ran her name through the system. Alana Simmons. Her parents are connected to something big, James. Something you won't believe." James's eyes widened, a knot forming in his stomach. He had thought this was just an ordinary traffic stop gone wrong, but now it felt like the pieces of a much larger puzzle were beginning to emerge. "What are you talking about?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniels glanced back at Alana, who was still sitting silently in her chair, as if she had heard none of the conversation. "Her father is James Simmons," Daniels continued. "The same James Simmons who just last month was sworn in as the new chief of police for the entire city." James's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Chief Simmons. The man who had a reputation for reforming the department, for bringing transparency and fairness to a force that had long been plagued by corruption. James had heard of him, but he hadn't known he had a daughter this young. A chill ran through his spine as the realization hit him. "You're telling me this is his daughter?" James repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. He knew the chief was a powerful figure, one whose reputation stretched far beyond the department. If Alana was really his daughter, then what had he just done? Daniels nodded. "That's not all. James Simmons has a history. His name carries weight. You remember those community outreach programs, the ones aimed at bridging the gap between the police and the public? Well, it turns out his daughter, Alana, has been at the center of those efforts. She's known for her charity work, for helping kids in underprivileged neighborhoods, and her father's name has been a beacon of hope for the community. This could get ugly, James." James's mind was spinning. He had arrested the daughter of one of the most influential men in the city, and now the gravity of his mistake felt like a physical weight on his chest. "What's going to happen?" James asked, his voice hoarse. Daniels looked at Alana again, his expression softening. "If her father gets wind of this, you can kiss your career goodbye, James. You're going to have to explain yourself, and it's not going to be pretty. You don't mess with a man like Simmons." The room seemed to shrink as James absorbed the weight of Daniels's words. His career, his life. It was all hanging in the balance now. He had no idea what Chief Simmons would do, but he knew one thing for certain. It wouldn't be good. Should we let her go? James asked, his voice uncertain. Daniel shook his head. It's not that simple. We need to figure out how to handle this. But for now, don't let her out of your sight. You've already made your move, and there's no turning back now. James glanced at Alana once more. She was still sitting there, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if she could sense the shift in the air. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. This girl wasn't a criminal. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in a situation that neither she nor her brother had asked for. As Daniels left the room to handle the paperwork, James was left alone with his thoughts and with Alana. His fingers drummed nervously against the desk as he stared at the floor, trying to piece together the situation in his mind. How had things gotten so out of control? The door to the office opened again, but this time it wasn't Daniels. It was someone else. James's heart skipped when he saw the figure standing in the doorway. Luke, Alana's older brother, stood there, his face flushed with panic. He had been pacing the parking lot outside the precinct, waiting for any sign of his sister. When he had seen the officers bring her inside, he had lost all hope of things working out. The sight of his sister in a police interrogation room had shattered any illusion of security. He had come to the precinct for answers, but now that he was here, he felt even more helpless. Is she okay? Luke asked, his voice shaky. What's happening to her? James looked at the young man standing in the doorway, his heart sinking. He had arrested this girl. He had torn her away from the only family she had in the world. And now he was faced with the undeniable truth that his actions were about to have far-reaching consequences, not just for Alana, but for his entire career. I'm so sorry, James said, his voice low and strained. You have no idea how sorry I am. This was a mistake. Luke's eyes narrowed. What kind of mistake? James hesitated, unable to give a clear answer. How could he explain the feeling of regret that had washed over him? How could he put into words the crushing realization that he had just made the biggest error of his career? Before he could respond, another officer entered the room, holding a phone. James, you're going to want to take this. James took the phone with shaking hands, his stomach twisting. He already knew who it was before the voice on the other end spoke. Officer James, the voice said, smooth and calm, but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. This is Chief Simmons. I need to speak with you. Now. The world seemed to stop. The consequences of a decision. The sound of the phone ringing echoed in Officer James's ears as he stood there, frozen, with the receiver pressed against his ear. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath caught in his throat. Every instinct told him that this call, this moment, would be the turning point, not just for his career, but for his entire life. The voice on the other end was calm, collected, but there was an undeniable power in it. Officer James, this is Chief James Simmons. I understand you have my daughter in custody. The name James Simmons sent a cold shiver down James's spine. The weight of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. Chief Simmons was one of the most respected figures in law enforcement, known for his progressive reforms, his efforts to bridge gaps between police and communities, and his strong stance on fairness and justice. James had heard of him many times in the media, and he had been among those who praised the chief's leadership. But never in his worst nightmares had James imagined that he would find himself on the other end of a conversation like this. James struggled to find his voice. Sir, I didn't know it was your daughter. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding, and I don't care about your reasons, officer. Chief Simmons cut in, his voice still eerily calm. What I do care about is the fact that you have my 9-year-old daughter in your custody, and I want her out of there right now. James swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. His hands were trembling, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could handle the weight of what was happening. He had acted on his instincts, his training, but now those instincts were telling him he had made a critical error. "Sir, please understand," James said, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to maintain control. "I didn't mean to cause any harm. I thought she was out of school, wandering the streets. I wasn't sure if something was wrong, and I didn't have all the information. But I realize now that I made a huge mistake." Chief Simmons didn't respond immediately, and for a few tense seconds, the silence was unbearable. Finally, the chief spoke again, his tone much colder now. "I don't know what went through your mind when you decided to take my daughter into custody, but what I do know is that you're going to have to answer for this. You've made an enemy out of the wrong person today, Officer James." The word hung in the air like a heavy fog. James's heart raced, and he felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. It was one thing to make a mistake, but it was something else entirely to realize that he had upset someone with the power and influence of Chief Simmons. The consequences of this would reach far beyond a reprimand or a suspension. It could cost him his job, his reputation, and possibly even his freedom. "I'll release her immediately," James said, his voice thick with regret. "I understand the severity of the situation, and I will make sure she's taken care of." "You'd better. And don't think this will be forgotten easily. I'll be in touch soon, officer. We'll discuss this further," the chief said, his voice unwavering. Before James could respond, the line went dead. He lowered the phone slowly, his hand shaking as he stared at the receiver, still processing what had just transpired. A flood of emotions, fear, guilt, shame, washed over him. This wasn't just an ordinary mistake. This was a catastrophic misstep, one that could unravel everything he had worked for. As he turned to face Alana, who had been silently watching him the entire time, the gravity of the situation fully sank in. Her wide, innocent eyes were filled with confusion. But there was also a spark of recognition. Alana had heard every word of that conversation. She knew exactly who her father was, and now she knew just how deep this mistake ran. James felt a wave of shame hit him. He had questioned her innocence, arrested her, and subjected her to this interrogation, all because he had assumed she was in the wrong. But Alana wasn't just any child. She was the daughter of a man who had worked tirelessly to fix a broken system. She was the face of the very reform he had championed. And now, in the span of a few hours, James had become the antagonist in her story. Alana didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, her small hands folded in her lap, her gaze unwavering. James could feel the weight of her stare, the silent judgment from someone so young. She wasn't angry. She wasn't crying. She was just waiting. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Alana spoke, her voice small but clear. "Am I going to be okay?" James swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to answer. He had no idea how to reassure her. He didn't even know if he could make this right. But he knew one thing for certain. He had to get her out of here, and he had to do it fast. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to be okay. I promise." He stood up, moving quickly to the door. As he reached for the handle, he glanced back at her. Alana hadn't moved, still sitting motionless in the chair. He felt a pang of guilt, but there was no time to dwell on it. The chief's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of how far-reaching the consequences of his actions could be. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, his mind already racing with the next steps. He needed to find a way to fix this. The longer Alana stayed in the precinct, the more the situation would spiral out of control. He needed to act fast. As he walked toward the front desk to speak with the officer on duty, a cold realization settled over him. He had no idea how to undo the damage he had done, but one thing was clear. The fallout from this would be far-reaching, and it wasn't going to be easy to escape. Back in the interrogation room, Alana had begun to fidget in her chair. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if her father would be furious with her for getting into trouble, or if he would be disappointed in her for making him worry. She had never felt so small, so vulnerable in her life. She just wanted to go home, to be with her family, to escape this nightmare. But she also knew something that James hadn't fully realized yet. Her father wasn't the kind of man who would let this go without consequences. And Officer James, despite his apology, would soon find out just how much power Chief Simmons held and how much the officer had underestimated the situation. As James returned to the interrogation room to release her, Alana couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm wash over her. The storm was far from over, but she knew one thing for sure. Her father would handle it. Her father always handled things. The ripple effect. The precinct seemed quieter now, a stillness that matched the nervous energy thrumming through Officer James's chest. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he made his way back to the interrogation room. He had spoken to the officer on duty, who was already preparing the paperwork to release Alana. But it wasn't that simple. The weight of the situation still lingered, suffocating him with every step. As he approached the room, the door was slightly ajar. Through the small gap, he could see Alana still sitting at the desk, her posture unchanged. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She hadn't moved much since the phone call with her father, as if she was waiting for the world to shift and set things right again. When James entered the room, Alana didn't look up. Instead, she continued to sit in silence, her eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of the precinct. It struck James then just how small she appeared, like a little girl caught in something far beyond her control. This wasn't just a mistake on his part anymore. It was the beginning of something much bigger. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "Alana," he said gently, his voice softening. "I'm so sorry for what's happened. I shouldn't have." "It's okay," she interrupted him quietly, lifting her gaze to meet his eyes for the first time since their conversation had started. Her eyes were wide, but there was no anger in them, only a quiet strength that James didn't expect from someone so young. James hesitated, unsure of what to say next. He was still processing the weight of what he had done. The chief had made it clear that there would be consequences, but it wasn't just his career that was on the line. It was Alana's life and future too. How could he have been so careless? How could he have let his doubts about her, a child, get the best of him? "I know you're scared," James said, his voice thick with regret. "I know you probably don't understand what's happening, but I'll make sure you get home. I'll get you back to your brother. I promise." Alana didn't say anything at first. She just watched him, her face still calm, though her eyes flickered with something deeper, a quiet understanding of how fragile the world could be. She wasn't naive. She knew the stakes, even if she didn't fully comprehend them. She had grown up with her father, the new chief of police. She had heard the stories. She had seen the pressure, the long hours, and the constant struggle to make things right. She was no stranger to the complexities of life, even at such a young age. "I just want to go home," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I want to see Luke." The way she said it, so simple, yet so resolute, struck James deeply. She wasn't angry with him, at least not in the way he had expected. She didn't blame him for what had happened. Instead, she was just focused on the one thing that mattered to her, being with her brother. "I'll get you there, Alana," he said, taking a step forward. "Just give me a moment." As James stepped out of the room to finalize her release, his mind raced. What had seemed like a routine day of patrol had escalated into something entirely different. He was now caught in the middle of a storm he had never expected. The chief's call had made it clear that James wasn't the only one affected by his actions. The entire police department was going to feel the ripple effects of this mistake, and it was unclear how far those ripples would spread. The next few hours felt like a blur. James signed the release papers and handed them over to the desk sergeant. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. His reputation had already been tarnished, but he couldn't quite grasp the full extent of the consequences. Chief Simmons wasn't someone to be taken lightly. James had no doubt that the chief would be demanding a full investigation into the events of the day, and James would be at the center of it. But beyond his own career, James couldn't stop thinking about Alana. She was just a little girl caught up in something so much bigger than her, something that had spiraled out of control. She was innocent in all of this. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, she had paid the price for his error in judgment. He had arrested her. He had caused her fear and confusion. And for what? For being in the wrong place at the wrong time. James made his way back to the interrogation room, the door creaking slightly as he pushed it open. Alana stood up the moment she saw him, and for the first time, a small smile tugged at her lips. There was no anger in her expression, no trace of resentment, only a quiet gratitude. In her eyes, James could see the weight of the situation had not escaped her, but she was stronger than he had given her credit for. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice sincere. She wasn't speaking to him out of politeness or fear. She genuinely meant it. James's throat tightened as he looked down at her. He hadn't expected gratitude, not after what he had put her through. But there it was in her eyes. "I'm sorry," James repeated, this time with more conviction. "I'll get you back to your brother, Alana. I promise." He led her through the building, his steps heavy as the consequences of his actions loomed larger with every passing second. Outside, Luke was waiting, pacing back and forth, his face filled with worry. The moment he saw his sister emerge from the building, his expression softened into relief. Without a word, he rushed over to her, pulling her into a tight hug. "I knew you'd be okay," Luke said, his voice shaking with emotion. Alana smiled, burying her face in her brother's chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe again. The nightmare was over, and she was finally going home. James watched them, standing silently a few feet away. He could feel the weight of their family's relief, but it didn't lift the burden on his shoulders. As he watched the siblings reunite, he knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. He had crossed a line, and he wasn't sure how he would be able to make things right. He was about to face a reckoning that would stretch far beyond the walls of this precinct. His career was hanging by a thread, but more importantly, he had learned a painful lesson about judgment, assumptions, and the consequences of his actions. The ripple effects of this moment would continue to unfold in ways he couldn't yet predict. And for Alana and her family, this moment would be a turning point too. A test of resilience and a reminder of the injustices that still needed to be confronted. As Alana and Luke walked away, disappearing into the quiet of the streets, James took one last look at the precinct. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't undo the past. All he could do now was face whatever came with the same honesty and courage he had failed to show earlier. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could do it. The reckoning. The days that followed the incident moved slowly for Officer James. Each moment seemed to stretch out endlessly, the weight of his actions hanging over him like an unshakable cloud. After Alana's release, he tried to bury himself in his usual duties, hoping that time and routine would dull the discomfort gnawing at his conscience. But the truth was, he couldn't escape what he had done. He couldn't forget the terrified look on Alana's face, nor the certainty in her eyes when she had told him she just wanted to go home. It wasn't just the chief's reaction that haunted him. It was the realization that he had taken an innocent child, separated her from her family, and subjected her to a nightmare that she should never have had to experience. It was one thing to make a mistake, but it was another to realize the full extent of how much harm that mistake could cause. James sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the paperwork in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The phone call from Chief Simmons was still fresh in his memory. It had been brief, but the power in the chief's words had been undeniable. The man didn't waste time. He didn't mince words, and James had no illusions about what that meant. He had expected an official inquiry, maybe a suspension, perhaps even a formal reprimand, but what he hadn't anticipated was the swiftness of the chief's decision. By the time James had finished his shift the day after the arrest, word had already spread through the department that an investigation was underway. The chief wasn't taking this lightly. Neither was the public. It was no longer just a mistake. It was now a public spectacle. A knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Sergeant Daniel standing in the doorway, his face serious, but his eyes avoiding direct contact. "James, you need to come with me," Daniel said quietly, his voice lower than usual. James stood, his heart skipping a beat. He didn't need to ask where they were going. He had already seen the writing on the wall. This was it. The chief had made his move. There was no avoiding the consequences now. He followed Daniels down the narrow hallway of the precinct, the air thick with anticipation. As they approached the briefing room, James's stomach twisted into knots. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see several officers already gathered inside, their conversations muffled as they awaited his arrival. As he entered the room, all eyes turned to him. Chief Simmons stood at the front of the room, his arms folded across his chest, his expression stern. The room fell into an uneasy silence. James felt every eye on him, the weight of their judgment pressing in on him from all sides. He had no idea what the chief intended to do, but one thing was clear: this was a reckoning. "Officer James," Chief Simmons said, his voice cutting through the silence, his words deliberate. "We're here today to discuss an incident that has caused considerable disruption, not only within this department, but also within the community we serve. A mistake was made, but it wasn't just any mistake. It was a mistake that has affected a child, a family, and the very trust we are supposed to uphold as law enforcement officers." James's throat tightened as he stood at attention, his hands trembling slightly. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. He knew nothing he could say would change the fact that his actions had set this chain of events in motion. The chief continued. "On the morning of date, Officer James made the decision to arrest a 9-year-old girl, Alana Simmons, without fully understanding the situation. He acted on suspicion alone, based on assumptions that were not backed by facts. This decision was not only an error in judgment, but it was also a violation of the trust we are supposed to have with the public." James's heart sank. There was no denying the truth in those words. The chief's disappointment was palpable, and James felt it like a weight crushing his chest. "We've had our share of mistakes in this department, but this one," the chief said, his voice growing colder, "is different. Alana Simmons is my daughter, and she did nothing wrong. She should never have been treated the way she was. The trust between law enforcement and the community is fragile, and every time we make a mistake like this, we damage that trust beyond repair." James's breath came in shallow gasps. His mind raced as the chief's words echoed in his ears. His mistake had hurt more than just a little girl. It had hurt the very foundation of what he had sworn to protect. "I understand the pressure we are under," the chief continued, his voice now tinged with frustration. "But pressure doesn't excuse poor judgment. It doesn't excuse treating people, especially children, like criminals when they've done nothing wrong. As officers, we are held to a higher standard, and we must answer for our actions." James opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he explain that he had made a decision based on fear, based on the desire to control a situation that had quickly spiraled out of his hands? The room was silent as the chief waited for James's response. He was a man of few words, and the weight of his gaze was enough to make James feel small, insignificant. He wasn't sure if he was being judged as an officer or as a man who had lost his way. After what felt like an eternity, the chief spoke again. "We will be conducting a full review of the events that transpired that day. And in the meantime, Officer James, I'm placing you on administrative leave. You'll be suspended from duty until the investigation is complete." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Administrative leave. Suspended from duty. It was the inevitable next step, and yet hearing it come from the chief's mouth felt like a death sentence. "I hope this serves as a lesson to you, James," the chief said, his voice unwavering. "We don't get second chances in this line of work. We are tasked with protecting the community, not terrorizing it. The truth will come out, and I trust that you will take responsibility for your actions." With that, the chief turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway as he disappeared from view. The other officers in the room remained silent, their eyes avoiding James. He could feel the weight of their judgment, but more than that, he could feel the weight of his own shame. As he left the briefing room, Daniels walked up beside him, his expression unreadable. "You know it was coming, right?" James nodded numbly, his mind still processing everything that had just transpired. "I didn't think it would hit this hard." "Doesn't matter," Daniels said quietly. "The chief's right. You're a good cop, but you messed up. Now you have to face the consequences. We all do at some point." The words stung, but they were true. James had failed to uphold the very standards he had sworn to defend. He had allowed his judgment to be clouded by assumptions, and in doing so, he had hurt a little girl and her family. But the worst part was knowing that the damage he had done wasn't just to Alana. It was to himself. As he stepped out of the precinct and into the street, James looked up at the cloudy sky, a heavy weight pressing down on him. He had no idea where his life would go from here. He had been put on leave, but what would happen when the investigation was complete? Would he be able to return to the force, or had his career come to an end? One thing was certain. He had learned a painful, irreversible lesson, and no matter where this journey took him, the consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. In the days that followed, as the investigation continued, Officer James found himself reflecting on everything that had led to that fateful day, the choices, the mistakes, the consequences. But most of all, he thought of Alana, and the realization that, in one moment, he had broken the trust that held everything together. It was a mistake he would never forget, and one, he knew, that would haunt him for the rest of his life.